I think one of the hardest things about being a reader in the 21st century is just figuring out what to read next. We've got a couple of millennia worth of books that have been written and nowhere near enough time to read them all. So how do you figure out which of the millions, I don't know if it's millions, but I'm going to say millions, which of the millions of books that have been written and published that you should read next? Well, one of the ways that I sort of sort through this is I go based on what people recommend to me, people whose opinions I trust. And my guess is if you are the type of person who watches videos on YouTube about what books someone is reading, you're probably in the same boat. So if that's you, stick around in this video because in this video, I'm going to go through the top 10 books that are most recommended by people who watch this channel. What's up, readers? My name is Adam, aka A Dude Who Reads, and in today's video, I'm going to walk you through the most common suggestions I get from viewers of this channel who have dropped me a line and said, if you like the stuff that you talk about, then you should definitely check this out. Without me preambling a lot more, because that is something I definitely have a tendency to do, let's jump straight into the list and I can ramble about the specific books instead of rambling about how the list was made. Sound good? Okay, let's just jump into it. Starting off at position number 10 with Stoner by John Williams. Now, Stoner is a book that I actually talked about on this channel already at the beginning of the year when I talked about the books that I read early in 2024. Stoner by John Williams is one of those books, and I said this in that original video, but I think it bears repeating. It's a book that was never on my radar before. I had no idea that this book existed. I didn't know anything about it. And yet in the last year or so, it popped up so often in conversations that I had with people or in watching content made by some people who I respect or by people who just flat out recommended the book to me based off of my reading tastes that I was like, how did I not know this book existed? And yet here it is. It is a little bit of a Booktube darling. It's been talked about a lot. And the reviews of it are, you know, for all intents and purposes, every review I've ever seen of it has been overwhelmingly positive. I think the book is fantastic. It is a book that is really about a man's search for his identity and coming into that identity and how that identity is the thing that sort of preserves him through what otherwise would be a very sort of bleak and depressing life. I think the book actually has a very uplifting message, but you could also read it as one that is a little bit more depressing depending on how you interpret it. I think that's one of the most powerful things about this book. There are different ways to read it. I would really be curious if it is a book that you've read, what your feelings are on it. Is it, you know, one of those books that you take inspiration from, or is it one of those books that you see beauty in sort of the tragedy of it? If you have read Stoner by John Williams, drop me a line in the comments below and tell me what you thought about it. The next book that viewers of this channel have recommended to me on multiple occasions is In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. And you'll see in the B-roll that I have showing on the screen at this point, maybe, that I have a copy of the first volume of In Search of Lost Time, which in English is Swan's Way. My copy is in French because my plan has long been to read all of In Search of Lost Time in its original language, which is French. In Search of Lost Time is, according to many people, the greatest novel ever written. I have not yet read it. I have long planned to read it, but because In Search of Lost Time is such a massive tome, I think it actually makes War and Peace look small, and because I always wanted to read it in the original French, and my French reading speed is slower than my English reading speed, the time to read it just has not presented itself to me, which might have something to say about the entire subject matter of the book too, because I can't find the time to read In Search of Lost Time. I feel like there is sort of a meta reckoning in here that Proust would get some sort of satisfaction out of. All that to say, I'm not sure there's anything I can say about In Search of Lost Time that hasn't been said before. Like I said, many people who know about these things have claimed that this is one of the greatest, if not the greatest novel ever written. Certainly many people believe it is the greatest novel ever written in French. So I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to reading it. It is probably going to be an investment of probably several months, if not years of my life to read through the entire thing, but I will get through it because it is one of those things that is definitely on my bucket list to do. The next book on the list is a little bit of a detour from where we've been so far. So we go from sort of a modern classic in Stoner to an all-time classic in Search of Lost Time to I don't know what this is. I guess some people would call it an all-time classic, but definitely fans of the fantasy genre would consider this sort of the original fantasy classic, and that is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, the reason that this gets recommended to me so often is most likely because I have in the past said that I enjoyed The Hobbit to the point where The Hobbit is one of my favorite books of all time, and I actually preferred The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings is something that I think I read definitely over 20 years ago. And I obviously, it made a mark on me because to this day, I still do read the fantasy genre and I recognize its importance in that genre. You can't read fantasy without recognizing the impact that Tolkien had on the entire genre. Some people say the genre would not exist without him. I don't know if I'd go that far, but definitely there's no question that he had a monumental impact on the fantasy genre. My personal take on The Lord of the Rings has always been a little bit divided. I respect it. I understand why it's so beloved, and yet in and of itself, it is not my favorite fantasy novel. That being said, by the way, there's debate amongst true Tolkien fans whether you should consider The Lord of the Rings as a trilogy or as a single novel, because Tolkien originally intended this to be a single work, but it had to be split in three because of publisher, whatever. Doesn't really matter. I'm getting off topic. But the point here is that my relationship with The Lord of the Rings is a little bit complicated. So one of the things that I've actually committed to doing is going back and rereading The Lord of the Rings after a couple of decades since the last time I read it, and approaching it with a fresh eye. I'm a much more mature reader. I'm a lot more patient as a reader. And so maybe some of the things that bothered me when I first read it, frankly, as someone who's probably in their teens, I didn't have the same patience for world building. I didn't have the same patience for learning Elvish languages and all this stuff, which is really what Lord of the Rings is all about. A lot of walking in there. Perhaps it would connect with me a lot better now. And so that is definitely something that I'm looking forward to revisiting and seeing if my feelings on The Lord of the Rings have changed. And so probably at some point in the next year or so, that is something that I'm going to be rereading. The next most recommended book on this list is one that is actually from a similar time period to The Lord of the Rings, but is in a completely different universe, genre, everything. It is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. So I have not read The Grapes of Wrath, which is one of those things which I've always considered a major hole in my sort of reading experience. I have read other works by John Steinbeck, and in fact, I think Of Mice and Men is probably one of my favorite short novels. Maybe you could even call it a novella of all time. I am not ashamed to say that by the end of Mice and Men, I was crying like a baby. I spent a little bit of time down in the area of California where a lot of Steinbeck's stories are set, and so I have a true admiration for the man as an author. But I haven't read The Grapes of Wrath, which is probably his most well-known work, and that is definitely a gap in my reading knowledge, and so that is something that I'm looking to correct in the near future here. But The Grapes of Wrath is something that's been recommended to me by multiple people, and so now I'm looking forward to seeing how that slots in and how it compares to some of the other Steinbeck works that I've read in the past. Coming in at number 6 on the list is a book that is not without any controversy, and that is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. And this is one of those books which I read and did not give nearly enough attention to. I read it during a period in my life where I was reading things because I had to read them, not because I was enjoying reading them. And so I kind of feel like I never gave this book the proper attention that it deserved. To give you an idea of how little attention I was paying while I was reading this book, it didn't even impact me enough to be disturbed by the subject matter, which is the reason why this book is so controversial to many people. Because obviously, if you know anything about Lolita, you know that there is a certain feeling that you are supposed to have towards the main character in the story. You are not supposed to like them. You are not supposed to feel good about spending time with them. If anything, you're supposed to feel awkward and not feel good about spending any level of time in their fictional presence. That being said, Lolita is considered by many to be an absolutely epic work and a work of staggering genius. The other thing that is super impressive to me about Lolita is that it was written in the author's second language. So Nabokov was not a native English speaker, and yet he penned one of the books that is often considered by many people to be one of the greatest books in English literature. So definitely a book that I need to revisit, and one that I need to spend more time on, and that I need to give a little bit more of my mature attention to. I feel like this is the type of book that is wasted on a younger audience because they can't fully appreciate the nuances of it and sort of the pathos behind the writing that you see in Lolita. At number 5 on the list of most recommended books by viewers of this channel, we have Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. And this is a book which I have no idea how I have yet to read, because it is often held up as sort of the best comedic novel or best satirical novel ever written. And if you know anything about me and you know anything about my taste in books, you know that I love a book that can make you laugh. And so I'm a huge fan of Douglas Adams. I like humor in a lot of my fiction. And there's a book later on in this list which I'll talk about, where the thing that I enjoyed the most about the book is probably the fact that it was surprisingly funny. That being said, I somehow have managed to get through this much of my life without having read Catch-22. And so it is one of those things where it's sort of an obvious book to recommend to someone like me who appreciates humor, and I just somehow have not yet read it. So that correcting that and getting to reading Catch-22 in the near term is something that I absolutely need to do. And then hopefully I can say I have read the funniest books that have ever been published in the English language. And maybe once I've read Catch-22, I'll make a video about some of my favorite funny books, and those of you like me who like a little bit of humor in their writing can enjoy that along with me. I don't know. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see if that comes out in the next couple months. Let's move on to the next one. At number 4 on the list is a book that honestly surprised me by how often this was recommended to me, because I did not think people love this book as much as they apparently do. And that is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. And The Count of Monte Cristo obviously is a really well-known story, and it has been around forever and everyone knows about it, but it's not a book that I would typically expect to see on a list like this, especially because I don't know what it is that I have read that means that other people point to it as something that they feel that I would really enjoy. So I have not read The Count of Monte Cristo in its entirety. I did read passages of it when I was in school, because I studied in French, and so we read some of Dumas in school, and so we read sort of selections from The Count of Monte Cristo, but I've never read the entirety of it before. Now, if I do go on to read the entirety of The Count of Monte Cristo, chances are I will read it in its original French, and since I'm already planning on reading In Search of Lost Time, and that is probably going to take me God knows how long, it might be a while before I get around to The Count of Monte Cristo, but I do think at this point, I thought I knew what this story was about, and I thought I had a good enough grasp of it that it wasn't necessarily something that was high up on my list of priorities of things to read. But when I see it where it is in like number 4 on a list like this, and it's been recommended that often, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's a reason why people love this book so much that I'm just not seeing. If this is one of your favorite books, I'd love to hear from you why you think it deserves to be so high on this list. Drop me a note in the comments below, because I will take the time to read it. I will get around to eventually, but I'm not going to lie, out of all the books on this list, this is probably the one that surprised me the most. Now, coming in at number 3 on the list is a book that really is no surprise to me at all, and this is because I spend so much time on this channel talking about how much I love War and Peace, that obviously when people hear that I love War and Peace, the first thing that they will say to me is, well, they'll usually say one of two things, and I will come back to what the second thing is when we talk about the number 1 book on this list. But so there's 2 books that usually come back when I mention that I love War and Peace. One of them is the one that's sitting here at the number 3 spot, and that is Anna Karenina, also by Leo Tolstoy. And so generally speaking, what I have determined is that a lot of people, after they hear me say that I have read War and Peace, what they'll say to me is, well, I haven't read War and Peace, or I haven't gone through War and Peace, but I did read Anna Karenina, and Anna Karenina is fantastic. So if you haven't read that, you should definitely read that. And I think a lot of people would suggest that if you were trying to get into Tolstoy as an author, that you probably don't start with War and Peace, that you actually start with Anna Karenina because it's a little bit more accessible. I did things the other way around. I have not read Anna Karenina yet, but obviously I have loved what I found in War and Peace so much, and I love Tolstoy's writing so much that it is a foregone conclusion that eventually I will have to read about Anna and her story. It's just a question of finding time, because if there's one thing that you'll notice about a lot of the books on this list is they're all really freaking huge, with a few exceptions, but there's a lot of really big books on this list. So apparently when people recommend books to me, they just assume that I'm okay with reading 1,000-page tomes, which I am, but obviously it's going to take me longer to get to a few of them. The number 2 most recommended book on this list is now going along with number 4, which was also a surprise to me, which was The Count of Monte Cristo. Number 2 was probably other big surprise to me, because I had heard of this book, but I never realized that people loved it so much, or that people placed it so high on their list of favorite books. To me, it was just kind of another one of those books, which is, fine, enjoyable, but not anything special. And that book is The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. And The Pillars of the Earth, based on everything that I've been told, is one of those books that just completely changed how the world regarded a specific author. So Ken Follett had a career as a relatively successful author of, kind of airport-style paperback novels, is my understanding. And then he decided to take a hard left turn, and he published Pillars of the Earth, which is, again, a massive tome, and really delves into kind of historical fiction. And my understanding is Pillars of the Earth, obviously I'm saying all this as my understanding because I have not read this, but my understanding is Pillars of the Earth is the first book in a series of books. And so Pillars of the Earth is something which completely took everyone who was a Ken Follett fan by surprise, because he went from being an author who was kind of enjoyable to read to an author who was writing really sort of serious and books that could be considered as actual, quote unquote, great books, and that you could start to look at as actual literature as opposed to just sort of fun, pulpy sort of novels. Now, as someone who reads both, literature and more fun, pulpy type novels, to me, that distinction is always something that's a little bit blurry, and I have a really hard time kind of looking down my nose at any type of author. But I really find this book fascinating because it is one of those few times that you see an author make sort of that jump over from kind of being a, popular author to being a serious author in the minds of sort of readers. And so to be able to watch an author do that, to me, I think is something that's really incredible, because once you become kind of a popular author, a lot of people just make up their minds that everything you write from here on out is just kind of trashy, right? Or it's just for entertainment purposes and it can't be great art. Somehow Follett managed to bridge that gap with Pillars of the Earth. And if for no other reason than just that, I'm curious to check this out and, really sort of sink my teeth into it. And if that weren't enough, it is number 2 on the list of most recommended books people who watch this channel. So that is saying something. And now the moment that you've all been waiting for, or at least the 2 or 3 of you who are still watching this video, is the number 1 book recommended by viewers of this channel. And again, if you have watched this channel in the past, this probably will not come as a huge surprise to you. And so I'm not going to drag out the suspense any more than I already have, which is already too long. But the number 1 book that is the most recommended by viewers of this channel is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, again, when I have said in the past that I'm a huge fan of War and Peace, I mentioned there's 2 books that will often immediately be recommended to me. The first is Anna Karenina, also by Leo Tolstoy, and the other one is Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And usually the people who recommend Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky are recommending it because they want me to see that Dostoevsky is a better writer than Tolstoy. And for some reason, a lot of these people feel like they need to prove that, one of these 2 great Russian masters is better than the other. So as it turns out, I have actually already read The Brothers Karamazov just recently, and I did this along with my buddy Mike, who I met through this channel. If you're watching this, shout out, hey Mike. And we read this book together over the course of a couple months, and, him and I exchanged on it. We talked about it back and forth. We really kind of delved deep into this book. And I will tell you right now, Brothers Karamazov is an absolutely phenomenal novel. You don't need me to tell you that. Many people, kind of hold this book up as one of the greatest books ever written. Many very sort of popular figures in society today actually have named this as their favorite book of all times. And I feel like there's a specific This book is going through a moment right now in society where the message is really resonating with people. That being said, if you are trying to compare it to War and Peace, it is like comparing apples to oranges. The similarities between the Brothers Karamazov and War and Peace is sort of, they are both Russian classics. They are both set in the 19th century, and that's about where it ends, to be quite frank. Because aside from those two elements, maybe there's one more. Both of them have themes that are sort of lightly and tangentially related to God and religion. But that's it. Like, aside from that, those two novels could not be more different. The Brothers Karamazov, what really impressed me about the book is that even in reading a translation of it, and I'll show some of the B-roll here of the edition that I have that was translated by, I believe, Jonathan Pevere and with Lara Bolokonsky. I apologize if I've got that wrong or mispronounced it. The specific translation that I read, what really impressed me is Dostoevsky's writing style was super accessible, even coming through the translation. This is a writing style which is not about sort of impressing you with its sophistication. It's really about getting a message and telling a story. So Dostoevsky really feels more like a storyteller, whereas Tolstoy feels more like he's painting an image of the world that he is portraying. That might seem a little bit difficult to kind of wrap your head around, but if you've read the two books, you kind of understand where I'm coming from here. And so with the Brothers Karamazov, the other thing that took me by surprise is the novel's funny. Like, unlike a lot of sort of classic literature, which tends to be a lot more serious and deals with the sort of very deep themes, and the plot tends to, have a lot of sort of dramatic tension to it. Those things are present in the Brothers Karamazov, but it's also written in a way that's sort of kind of light, and the characters are drawn out in such a way that some of them are actually become caricatures of themselves. And so there are actual passages in this sort of classic literature novel where you will find yourself actually laughing out loud because some of the things that happen are just patently absurd, and that's kind of the point, right? The other difference that you'll notice when you're comparing Karamazov to War and Peace is that whereas the characters in War and Peace, I feel like Tolstoy goes out of his way to really create very complex, very sort of real characters, people that you feel like you could sort of bump into on the street, even if you're not living in sort of 19th century Russia. The main characters, the brothers Karamazov, are super interesting characters, but they're also sort of, they themselves feel more like allegories or metaphors, and that I believe that's kind of the point as well of the Brothers Karamazov, and to a certain extent it's a philosophical novel where the goal of the novel is to express an idea as much as it is to tell a story. And so the characters are just so over the top that, like, you will never meet a Dmitry Karamazov on the street. You will never meet anyone who is as good or as pure as an Alyosha. These people do not exist in real life. And yet the way that Dostoevsky brings them together in this book lends itself to telling an excellent story and really making you think deeply about certain thoughts. Makes you think deeply about sort of the role of religion in society, what happens if you don't have God, what happens when you have a father figure who is sort of absent or who purposely does a bad job, what is the role of parenthood. The number of themes that exist in this novel is absolutely astounding. So it is a phenomenal work, but to try and compare it to War and Peace is one of those things that would take a much brighter mind than mine. What I can say is both are excellent books, but both are very, very different, and I think each appeals to probably a different type of reader slightly. I can appreciate both. If I had to choose between the two of them, I would still say I liked War and Peace a little bit better, but that might have more to do with my personal preferences of the things I look for in a novel. But that does not do anything to diminish how great this book is. So all that to say, that was the #1 most recommended book by viewers of this channel, was Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I will say that Dostoevsky was by far the most recommended author of any author that was recommended to me. Again, probably because of how often I talk about Tolstoy. And the reason I included Brothers Karamazov on this list is because most people who mention Dostoevsky mention Brothers Karamazov. But I will say that some of the people who mentioned Dostoevsky either didn't name a novel at all when they said you should definitely read more Dostoevsky, or a few people also mentioned Crime and Punishment and The Idiot. So those are other Dostoevsky novels, obviously, which are also classics that you can check out. But Brothers Karamazov is the one that got mentioned the most often, and that is why it's the one that I am including in this list. So there you have it, the top 10 most recommended novels by people who watch A Dude Who Reads. I personally love this list because it is a list of books that people have created based off of their knowledge of what I'm reading. But just because they're not a list that's personalized to you, if you're watching this channel and if anything that I'm saying resonates with you, I definitely think there's a bunch of books on this list that could be appealing to you. The other thing I'd really love to ask of you, if you're still watching at this point, is if there's other books that are not on this list that you think I would really enjoy based on everything that you have heard me say, definitely drop more recommendations in the comments below. Obviously, I have more than enough books to keep me occupied for the next probably 3, 4, 5 years. But that doesn't mean that I'm not always on the lookout for the next great read. So if there's something that you absolutely think I would definitely enjoy, drop it in the comments below and let's start chatting. All right, until next time, happy reading. Cheers.